reaction with electrical charges to separate the DNA fragments.
Once separated on a piece of paper or a gel, a computer is brought in to help interpret the patterns found. And the final result is a photographic record of the sequences of guanine, thymine, cytosine, and adenine.
Whether on film or reprinted on paper, the sequences are very long. Geneticists today are a little like a child just beginning to read. They're still at the primer level. What will it be like when we reach the length and sophistication of a War and Peace length novel?
Okay, it's time to summarize the basic facts before we take a look at the controversial future, the engineering of new life forms.
1, the gene is the biological unit that carries heredity in every cell of every living organism, from viruses to fruit flies, from pea plants to people. 2, the gene itself is a molecular structure, a group of atoms that are part of a large molecule called deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. 3, it is the pattern of base sequences on the DNA that is the code, which when translated by living cells make a virus, a fruit fly, a pea plant, and a human. Not only in general, but a particular virus, a particular fruit fly, a particular pea plant, a particular human being. 4, when you change the structure of the DNA sequence, you change the code. You change the living tissue, you change the living organism. It's like changing the computer program or the words in a book. You end up with a new program, a new book. Maybe better, maybe worse. In the case of genes in nature, the new living organism that results from a change in the gene, it's called a mutation, is usually worse off than its parent. 5, very occasionally a mutation may lead to a new trait in the offspring that is to its advantage. That offspring will have a better chance to survive and pass on that new mutant gene to its offspring. And that's the way change and natural selections occur. Well, what does this all mean in practical life today? For one thing, today humans are trying to engineer genetic changes for the good. And they do this by using what is called recombinant DNA technology. Say you find a gene that is capable of some desired task, like cleaning up oil spills, producing insulin, gobbling up some nasty toxic waste, fixing nitrogen in a fertilizer, or whatever. Well, using one of the new restriction enzymes, you snip it out of the cell it is found in normally, and then you paste it into an opened up cell in a fast reproducing bacteria. You give the newly enhanced bacteria enough food and living space and let it reproduce. Within a very short time, you have billions on billions of these powerful new living things, new living factories. You purify the substances they have produced, bottle them, and sell them to people who need them. Similar techniques are also being developed to cut and paste genes from one organism to another, say from a bean plant into a corn plant, or from a bacteria into a rabbit. Here at a U.S. Department of Agriculture laboratory in Wisconsin, they are using a newly invented gene gun to transfer genes that resist mold into a barley plant. If successful, these experiments will lead to new varieties of barley that can themselves resist the mold epidemic that threatens barley crops all across the northern hemisphere today. Here in the laboratories of Lloyd Smith and his colleagues at the University of Wisconsin, they are making rapid advances in automating the search for the human genome. Predictions now are that the entire sequence of 3 billion base pairs will be in computer memories by the end of the first decade of the 21st century. And in one of the most dramatic breakthroughs this century, biologists in Scotland have cloned Dolly, the first mammal created from a cell taken from an adult of the same species. This feat was quickly followed by the successful cloning of 3 bull calves in DeForest, Wisconsin in the summer of 1997. Gene 1, Gene 2, and Gene 3 were all cloned from differentiated cells taken from a donor cow embryo. In cloning experiments, researchers take a nucleus from a cell in an embryo or in an adult animal. This nucleus, no matter what cell it comes from, skin, muscle, gland, contains all the genes of an organism. Well, they then take an egg cell from the same species of animal. They take out the nucleus of this egg cell and insert the nucleus of the donor animal in its place. Now they implant the new egg cell into a female surrogate mother. If all has been successful in the transfer, the single egg cell will now develop in the normal way inside the surrogate mother's uterus. And when born, the baby will be an exact duplicate of the adult sheep, cow, or potentially human from which the original cell was taken. All of these new technologies are helping us to understand life at its most basic molecular level. They are also challenging some of our oldest and most basic beliefs. Theory, evidence, and technology that can change basic life structures and behaviors bring up serious ethical and social problems. Now, these issues are being studied and debated today.
And now that you understand the basic principles of this new genetics, you too can take a role in the debate. For in a democracy like ours, how this immense new power is used will be up to the most important people, you and me.
Many Americans are distraught at the rollback of some of the protection zones.
They've gotten poorer and poorer.
It is about helping people.
The people who have the right to keep their arms. If they back to the times of the Amendment written, they would find that the amendment clearly would be protected for either.
I think we have a combination of individual rights and to
Here is a concept that Americans will virtually say, an idea that you have no illusion it's written. The idea that all people are endowed with certain basic rights, and individuals do how to make their own decisions, determine their own destinies, hold their own opinions, and express their beliefs. For years, we have strived for in various ways. Human rights, civil rights, natural law, unalienable rights. All the ways based on the individual need. Individualism exists. Is the cornerstone of Declaration of Independence, which says we hold these truths to be self-evident. In the goal of our Constitution, design, protect the dignity, order, we, as a society, have long struggled to bring our practices into mortality and when we were in the 1920s, every American nation for living recognized rights until the 1960s. The ongoing struggle over abortion today is largely a debate about individual rights, those of the mother and those of the unborn child. All of these great public debates have been aimed at building a nation that maintains a strong sense of community and yet allows the greatest degree of personal freedom. When the good of the many collides with the rights of the few or the individual, how do we resolve the conflict? When forced to choose one over the other, which do we consider more important? Sociology professor Robert Bellah has written extensively on the subject of individualism in America.
I think there's always been a tension, right back to the early days, the Revolutionary War, the Constitutional Convention, between an understanding of the common good and the common enterprise and an emphasis on individual rights, individual freedoms. And in a way, American politics right from the beginning has reflected some of these tensions.
Bellah and others argue that America's 220-year preoccupation with individual rights and freedoms has come at a high price to the quality of our society. Rand Corporation researcher Frank Fukuyama agrees.
I think the problem in the last generation or two is that that balance has really gone out of whack, and that the individualistic currents have really taken over at the expense of the more group-oriented ones. And I think a lot of the social problems that we face, including, you know, the disappearance of a general, you know, social trust in American society is really the result of a kind of hyper individualism that's been quite destructive.
Fukuyama feels that in many cases individual rights have been elevated above the common good, and that the state is not alone in suffering the consequences.
A lot of times it's at the expense of other forms of authority, neighborhoods, families, workplaces. All of those have been gravely weakened. You know, children and teenagers growing up today, you know, are very cynical about institutions and authority of all sorts. They're not willing to subordinate their personal, you know, likes and you know, interests, you know, to any form of authority.
Of course, not everyone shares these feelings. Nadine Strawson, who is national president of the American Civil Liberties Union, could not disagree more strongly.
I absolutely reject the notion that there's a dichotomy between individual rights on the one hand and the common good on the other hand. The whole philosophy on which this country and our government were founded was that the highest common good is the defense and protection of individual rights. It was that philosophy that was reflected in the Declaration of Independence, that the highest purpose of government is to protect individual freedom.
The ACLU is the nation's largest and oldest organization dedicated to enforcing all fundamental freedoms for people in the United States. Strawson feels the government has in many cases overstepped constitutional limits. She feels those who fear the excesses of individualism are missing the greater danger to society.
I think the argument that we have too much freedom and too many rights in this society at this date is ludicrous when I look at the enormous setbacks and assaults on individual rights that we've been facing recently at every level of government with respect to every right, and particularly embattled are the rights of the individuals who are already the least powerful and the least popular in our society.
The ACLU has developed a reputation in some circles as a defender of liberal freedoms. It is perhaps best known for its defense of free speech and the individual rights of people accused of committing crimes. But individual freedoms have formed the basis for liberal and conservative causes alike. The individual right to keep and bear arms is a fascinating barometer of our attitudes about individual rights and the good of our society. Gun ownership in America has reached an all-time high and shows no sign of slowing down. About half of all U.S. households have at least one gun. There are an estimated 200 million privately owned guns in this country, about a third of which are handguns. In an increasingly violent nation, people today buy them for protection against criminals. And some in the militia movement even claim to buy them as protection against the government, perhaps the ultimate statement of individualistic principle. Supporters of gun ownership feel it's a constitutionally guaranteed right, a personal choice in which the government may not interfere. But others find troubling the sheer number of guns among the population, the relative ease of access to them, and the staggering number of gun-related deaths in America, now some 35,000 a year. They cite gun rights as an example of individual freedom taken to an extreme, a deadly curse on society as a whole. Most arguments for and against gun ownership focus on the Second Amendment in the Bill of Rights. The amendment reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." The passage seems simple enough, but different people have interpreted those 27 words in entirely different ways. The first point of contention is usually whether the amendment guarantees the right to own guns for any purpose or only in the context of a state militia. Yale law professor Akhil Amar has researched the history of the Second Amendment and finds that the concept of militia is often misunderstood today. He says the founders viewed the militia less like an army and more like a present-day trial jury.
The jury is a random cross-section of the citizenry, sort of brought together to talk with each other and to evaluate the trial. And it's often a local body. A militia is very similar. It's not a group of paid professional government employees. That's an army, a standing army, and the militia was supposed to be different from that. But nor is it just people who like guns. That's a gun club.
Amar points out that early in American history, all men between the ages of 16 and 55 were required to own guns and be in the militia. But they were also required to assemble and train at regular intervals on the town square as part of their duty. Amar says it's important that militia members were not paid government soldiers, and they were not a select group. He says that means there are at least two things today that constitutionally defined militia is not.
It's not the National Guard, because the National Guard today, a bunch of semi-professional, paid government employees, they really are the Army, or more technically, the Army Reserve. So that's not quite the militia. But nor are these self-styled militias, the Michigan militia. They don't quite capture the idea of militia either, because it's self-selected. People opt in. That's more like a gun club. It's not all of us. It doesn't quite look like America. It's not this cross-sectional body. So we don't quite have the militia anymore the way we did 200 years ago.
Amar concludes that average citizens are the closest thing to a militia still in existence. But he notes that the wording of the Second Amendment is not as unequivocal as the more familiar First Amendment. There are a few strings attached.
The people do have a right to keep and bear arms. That's not an absolute, unconditional right. It can be regulated. The amendment talks about a well-regulated militia, but 200 years ago, the militia and the people, it was the same thing. The militia were the people were the militia.
University of Texas law professor Sanford Levinson doesn't own a gun, never has, and doesn't plan to. But he has become a frequently quoted legal scholar on behalf of gun lobbyists. He is among those who feel the general intent of the Bill of Rights is more important to consider than the modern definition of militia.
I don't know that it matters, quite frankly, because I think that the Bill of Rights generally were designed to limit the power of the national government. And I think that the Second Amendment can quite easily be read to limit the power of the national government to engage in any very restrictive regulation of arms unless there is a very, very good reason to do so.
Levinson acknowledges that the framers of the Constitution were more afraid of government tyranny than street crime when they drafted the Second Amendment. But he feels that modern concerns about public safety easily fall within the scope of the framers' intention.
I don't think that is at all a crazy argument, and it does strike me that it might well make sense to read the Second Amendment as protecting the rights of otherwise law-abiding people to engage in a very fundamental individual right of protecting themselves against people who wish them harm.
Members of the highly influential gun lobby take an even stronger stand. They say the Second Amendment is an absolute right that simply shall not be infringed. Larry Pratt, executive director of Gun Owners of America, opposes virtually any form of government gun regulation.
What a low view of our fellow Americans, or maybe even of ourselves, to suggest that giving us a powerful instrument like a firearm or an automobile is somehow something that is inherently suspicious and needs to be regulated by the government because it's almost certain to cause great danger if it's in the hands of the people. Well, the fact of the matter is that the opposite occurs. The American people are actually quite responsible in the use of firearms.
For many people, the problem with all these interpretations is that they place more emphasis on individual rights than on the impact of guns on American communities.
The people who support the right to bear arms, meaning the right to bear any arms of any description, want to discuss that right as if it were disconnected from everything else about society.
Sociologist and author Ann Swidler feels the gun ownership issue, like many others in American culture, has deteriorated into a debate strictly about rights. When that happens, she says, people on both sides of the issue dismiss any substantive consideration of the common good.
One of the things rights language allows you to do, in principle, is trump every other claim. If you have a right, then it doesn't matter how expensive it is. It doesn't matter how many people get hurt. It doesn't matter whether it's good for your community, your society, for your family. It doesn't matter what the risks are. Your right is absolute, and it's a claim that outweighs all other claims. You don't even discuss trade-offs.
Swidler does not view the American fascination with guns as a direct result of individualism gone astray. She sees it more as a group activity in disguise. The militia movement provides an example.
Here's a case where the right to bear arms can be justified in a highly individualistic sounding language, but the social activity it's associated with, if you know, the actual militias and the way they're organized, aren't individualistic at all. They're, again, you could use an extreme term like fascistic, but in any case, they're highly organized, they're centralized.
The line is ready. 2 shots on each target turn. There'll be no further commands.
In the state of Texas, the issue is not whether people have the right to own guns. That much is accepted. The issue is whether people should have the right to carry them concealed. The Texas legislature recently said yes, and so did Governor Bush, signing the bill into law. To carry a concealed gun, a Texas resident must be at least 21, have no history of major crime, mental illness, or drug or alcohol addiction, must not be delinquent in taxes or child support, must pass a handgun training course, and pay $140 to get a 4-year permit. Texas is not alone. It is simply the largest and most recent of states to approve a concealed weapons law in some form. Texas State Representative Bill Carter helped draft the new law and worked for its passage.
Predators pick on the weak, and if a criminal thinks that you might be able to defend yourself, they're not as likely to come after you as they are maybe someone whom they feel cannot defend themselves. So it's the element of surprise, and that came about as part of the debate, you know, whether or not you should have to have the gun showing or whether or not it should be concealed.
In Texas, the arguments on both sides of the issue are passionate and personal. Susanna Gracia Hupp, for example, watched helplessly as a crazed gunman killed 23 people at a cafeteria in Killeen, Texas in 1991. Susanna's mother and father were among those shot dead.
And I can't even begin to get across to you what it's like to sit there and simply wait for it to be your turn. You can't go up against a guy with a gun, with a butter knife, or a sugar shaker.
The irony is that Susanna frequently carried a handgun in her purse for protection. But on that day, she had left it in the car because a concealed weapon was then considered a felony offense in some circumstances.
So there was my gun 100 yards away. As everybody pretty well knows, this man continued to walk around the cafeteria totally without anybody being able to do anything and shoot people like fish in a barrel.
In the aftermath of her personal tragedy, Susanna became one of the most outspoken supporters of the right to carry concealed weapons.
I can tell you right now, I would much rather be sitting in jail with a felony offense on my head and have my parents alive. As strange as this may sound, I really don't blame the guy that did it. We're not talking about a career criminal. We're talking about somebody who went insane. He ended up killing himself at the end of this. Being mad at somebody like that is like being mad at a rabid dog. You don't be mad at it, you kill it. I am mad as hell at my legislators because they legislated me out of the right to protect myself and my family.
State Representative Sherry Greenberg of Austin, Texas, voted against the right to carry concealed guns. She says the mass shooting in 1991 is a perfect example of what can happen when so many handguns are in circulation on the streets of America.
You never know what is going to set someone off. And, you know, proponents have said, well, we are only allowing individuals who are law-abiding to have these weapons. Well, the fact of the matter is, everyone is law-abiding until that one instance when they prove themselves to be otherwise. People are rational until that one instance where they break and become irrational.
Representative Greenberg fully supports the right of people to own firearms and keep them in their homes. But she says concealed weapons are a different matter. The dangers to society, she feels, are severe enough to warrant government restriction of absolute personal freedom.
We have always put limitations on individuals in some fashion in order to have a civilized society. Speed limits. You're not allowed to drive 150 on the highway. Why? Because there's been a determination made that although it limits your individual freedom, the greater good, the safety of the thousands of people driving the highways has to be protected.
But Representative Carter contends that in this case, the majority of Texans are not in favor of such government restrictions.
Whether or not people are going to go get a permit or not is not the issue, but they feel like that right of self-determination was very important to them. And I think that that's going to hold up under any charges or trying to change anything as far as that legislation is concerned. Because the majority feel like it's a personal right.
Greenberg, however, notes that Texans have not been totally supportive of the new bill. 14 of the state's 20 largest cities have passed their own local laws banning concealed weapons. Under criminal trespass law, many offices and churches have done the same.
If this is such a good idea, why did everybody want to be exempted, and why have over 20 of the major corporations in this state decided that they will not allow concealed weapons, and many smaller businesses?
In other words, despite the new law, there is a rapidly shrinking number of places where Texans with permits can actually carry concealed guns. That concerns Larry Pratt, who feels the proliferation of guns in the right hands, along with the element of surprise, makes for a safer community.
The fact of the matter is the state is much better off today because more people are able to carry a firearm. And since they're concealed, the nasty thing is for the crooks, they don't know which one has a gun. And so everybody benefits.
Susanna Gracia Hupp is annoyed that a state concealed weapons law is even necessary. She's a firm believer that the right to carry a gun transcends the Constitution itself as a personal freedom.
Forget history, forget